The elevator still works. That's the first thing I tell people when they ask what I got for $2.1 million. An elevator. 52 feet of vertical travel in a reinforced concrete shaft built by the Army Corps of Engineers in 1961, maintained by nobody for 40 years, and restored by me at a cost of $47,000 including the modernized cab. The safety certification I obtained from an inspector in Salina, Kansas, who drove 4 hours each way and charged me $800 and said, quietly, as he signed the paperwork, that he'd inspected a lot of things in his career, and this was the most interesting. I paid him $1,200. Not because I had to, because I wanted him to remember the job favorably and associate that memory with me. That is the kind of man I was. My name is Russell Ainsworth. I was 51 years old when I acquired the property, 53 when the conversion was complete, and 54 when I understood, standing in a facility I had spent 2 years and most of my liquid assets transforming, that I had confused building something with deserving it. I made my money in agricultural logistics. Not farming, not equipment, the infrastructure between them. I owned Ainsworth Distribution Solutions, a grain handling and commodity transport company based in Hutchinson, Kansas, that I'd built from a single leased truck in 1998 into a regional operation with 14 trucks, 3 grain storage facilities, and a contracts portfolio that moved approximately 4% of the winter wheat harvested in the central Great Plains every year. I knew what it meant to move things. I understood systems, throughput, capacity constraints. I could look at a handling facility and tell you where the bottleneck was and what it was costing per hour. That competence was real. I want to say that because what comes later requires a foundation. I was not a fool with money. I was a specific kind of fool, the kind who understands one system completely and assumes that understanding transfers. The silo was a Atlas F missile installation decommissioned in 1965, one of 72 built across Kansas and Nebraska during the period when the Air Force decided that putting nuclear weapons in the ground was better than putting them in the air. It consisted of a surface support building, now a collapsed concrete shell I had demolished and removed, a crew access shaft 80 feet deep, 12 feet in diameter, concrete lined, a launcher facility, the actual silo, 170 feet deep, 52 feet in diameter at its widest point, a control center connected to the launcher by a horizontal tunnel at the 30-foot level, and a diesel fuel storage area, 2 buried tanks, each rated for 10,000 gallons, that the Air Force had emptied and sealed in 1966, and that I had cleaned and recertified in 2021 at a cost of $31,000. I paid $340,000 for the property. 47 acres of eastern Kansas farmland, with a hole in the ground that no one had figured out what to do with for 60 years. I knew what to do with it. I should tell you what I built because the specifics are what make the lesson expensive. Level 1 was the entry and operations center, converted from the former launch control facility. 2,800 square feet of finished space. 12-foot ceilings, which I know sounds modest until you understand that 12-foot ceilings at 30 feet below grade required a concrete pour that took 16 hours and a crew of 11. A communications suite with shortwave, satellite uplink, and a commercial VoIP system that would operate off our internal network when external connectivity failed. An operations desk with 6 monitors showing exterior cameras, internal environmental readings, and the primary console I'd had custom fabricated by a company in Denver that designed equipment for data centers. The console cost $28,000. I had the invoice laminated and kept in the top right drawer of the desk. not framed, in a drawer. I mention this because it distinguishes me from Craig Lefferts, who I've never met but whom I understand completely. Level 2 was residential, converted from the equipment room and former crew quarters. 8 private sleeping rooms, each 12 by 14 feet, each with a reading light, a ventilation duct, and a door that locked. I designed the rooms because I had read enough about enclosed space psychology to understand that privacy was a functional requirement, not a luxury. I believed I understood human needs because I'd spent 25 years managing humans. I understood their professional needs. I did not understand what happened to people in enclosed spaces under sustained stress. That lesson cost less than the console and taught me more. A common area with a dining table that seated 12, a kitchen with a commercial 6-burner propane range, a chest freezer, and 3 chest refrigerators I ran off the primary generator. Level 3 was storage. Food, 36 months at 6 adults, which I had calculated using a caloric modeling spreadsheet I built myself. Medical, I had hired a consulting physician to specify the kit. His fee was $4,200. The kit cost $31,000. I had never opened it. Water, 2 500-gallon tanks fed from a well I had drilled to 280 feet, with a hand pump backup and a filtration system I had tested once, found functional, and not tested again. Fuel, the recertified Air Force tanks, which I had filled to 60% capacity with diesel at a cost of approximately $47,000 at the market price when I filled them. 60% was 18,000 gallons. At my generator's rated consumption running 12 hours daily, that was approximately 32 months. I knew that number the way a grain elevator operator knows the bushel capacity of his bins. It was the number I thought about when I thought about the facility, which was constantly, which is a thing I understand now as a symptom. Level 4 was mine. At the base of the elevator shaft, at 52 feet below grade, a circular space 22 feet in diameter carved from the original launcher access area. I had poured a new floor, installed radiant heating, run electrical from the primary panel, and furnished it with items I had selected without consulting a designer because I did not want a designer's opinion. A desk, a reading chair, a bed. Bookshelves I had built myself over 2 weekends because I had decided at 51 that I was going to learn to build bookshelves and had learned adequately. They were not beautiful. They held books. There was also a small cabinet that held 12 bottles of single malt scotch and 8 bottles of bourbon, and 3 bottles of something I had purchased in a distillery in Wyoming, because the woman behind the counter had a quality of attention that made me want to demonstrate that I bought things without asking the price. I note this because it says something accurate about me. The Wyoming bottle sat unopened for the entire duration of the crisis. I could not open it without thinking about the attention that had prompted me to buy it. Attention I had purchased and could not return. I arrived at the facility on a Tuesday in late April at 4:23 in the afternoon. I know the time precisely because I had developed a habit of logging arrival times since the first site visit 3 years earlier. The habit was professional. I logged times on worksites. Here, I logged them because the logging was the only control I had over a situation that was moving faster than my ability to assess it. I had left Hutchinson at 2:10 p.m. after watching 2 hours of news coverage in which the word Bakersfield appeared with increasing frequency, and the word containment appeared with decreasing confidence. I had not called anyone. My ex-wife lived in Wichita with her husband, who managed a car dealership, and who had the specific quality of adequacy that good men in second marriages sometimes have, and I had no reason to contact her and no rights to her safety. My son was 26 and lived in Denver. I had called him 4 times in the previous year. 3 of those calls had been about taxes. The 4th had been on his birthday, and I had talked for 11 minutes and spent 7 of them discussing a Kansas State football game he had not watched. I did not call him. I note this not because I am proud of it. I note it because it is accurate. The drive from the county road to the facility entrance was 9/10 of a mile on a gravel track I maintained annually. The surface building I had demolished and replaced with a flat concrete cap and a maintenance shed disguised as farm equipment storage. A person driving past on the county road would see 47 acres of wheat stubble and a weathered metal shed. They would not see an elevator shaft. That invisibility had cost me $230,000 in site work and landscaping. I had considered it the most valuable investment in the facility. I was correct about this. I was also incorrect about why invisibility mattered. I had thought it mattered because it kept the facility unknown. It mattered because it kept the facility quiet. Those are different things. The facility was exactly as I had left it on my last inspection visit 42 days earlier. I ran the systems check I had developed over 3 years of practice. Generator, online. Fuel at 61%, the gauge reading a fraction higher than my records because I had not accounted for the fact that diesel expands slightly in April temperatures. I noted this in the log and corrected the formula. Water pressure normal, filtration cycling. Air, HEPA, an activated carbon system operating within spec. The air in the facility smelled like filtered air, which is a specific absence of smell, the smell of a space that has had all of its character removed. I had believed this was the right smell for a survival facility. I believe different things now. Food inventory, undisturbed. Medical kit, undisturbed. Level 4, exactly as I had left it. I sat at my desk and opened my operational log and wrote the date and time and the single line, facility secure, conditions outside deteriorating, watch and wait. Then I went to the kitchen and made dinner. The dinner was a freeze-dried meal, beef stroganoff, from a company in Utah that I had purchased from in bulk because the cost per calorie was competitive. The meal tasted like warm powder arranged to suggest food. I ate it because caloric intake was a system requirement and not because it was satisfying. That was my first evening alone in the facility. It was comfortable in every measurable way. It was the least comfortable I had felt in my adult life. On day 2, I found the notebook. Not mine. I kept my operational log on a desk in Level 4. This was in the Level 1 Operations Center, in the cabinet beneath the communications console, in a space I had designated for manual documentation of system readings. The notebook was a composition book, black and white, the kind sold in pharmacies. On the inside front cover, in handwriting that was small and deliberate, someone had written, "This is the pre-facility inspection log for Atlas Site Case 7, 2019-2022. Observer, D. Kessler." I opened it. It was 3 years of someone else's notes. Not my notes. Not written in my voice or in my format. Observation logs. The person who had written them had been visiting this facility before I purchased it. Not after. Before. The date started in March 2019. I purchased the property in September 2019. Before I was the owner, someone had been watching my property. I read for an hour. The entries were technical but not sterile. They noted the structural condition of the concrete at quarterly intervals. They noted the water table depth estimated from surface indicators. They noted the wildlife patterns around the site. They noted in several entries the specific acoustic properties of the silo shaft and how sound traveled from the surface to depth on still nights. And they noted, in 3 entries marked with a different pen, what appeared to be access to the site itself. Not breaking in, the language was more neutral than that. Site visited, control room accessible via West Hatch, conditions consistent with previous assessment. The West Hatch was an emergency egress I had sealed during the conversion. Sealed, I now understood, imperfectly. I went to the West Hatch. It was a steel plate in the floor of the storage tunnel, secured with 2 bolts. The bolts had been recently turned. Not by me. I sat in the storage tunnel with the notebook in my hands, and I understood 2 things. First, the facility had not been as unknown as I had believed. Second, the person who knew about it was someone who had spent 3 years observing it with the methodical patience of a person who intends to use it. Whether D. Kessler was someone I needed to find or someone who would find me was a question the following 2 days answered. On day 4 she knocked. Not at the West Hatch. At the communications console's external terminal, which I had installed for the specific purpose of allowing secure voice communication with people at the surface without opening any physical access point. The terminal had a keypad for outbound communication. For inbound, it had a button. Someone pressed the button at 6:47 a.m. I was in level 4, awake but not up, in the specific state of consciousness of a person who has been alone for 3 days and whose mind has begun conducting conversations with itself. The terminal alert was a low tone, not an alarm. I had calibrated it that way. It registered like a question rather than a demand. I climbed the elevator to level 1. I pressed the receive button. I said, "This is a private facility. Identify yourself." The voice that came back was female, unhurried, with the specific flatness of a person who has decided in advance that whatever response they receive will not change their approach. She said, "My name is Diane Kessler. I have been observing this facility since 2019. I know the structural layout, the access points, the system specifications, and the fuel and water capacity. I am standing at your surface entry with 2 other people, and I am asking you to let us in, not because I'm in distress, because you will need what I know before this is over and I would prefer to discuss it inside." I said, "How did you know this site was occupied?" She said, "The exhaust signature from the generator runs northeast on south winds. I've been monitoring from the DeVero property line since Monday." I had not accounted for exhaust signature. I had planned for visible light, acoustic output, thermal imaging, and vehicular tracks. I had not planned for someone who had spent 3 years learning to read this specific site. I said, "You wrote the notebook." She said, "Yes." I said, "You accessed the site before I purchased it." She said, "Through the West Hatch twice. I documented the condition and left. I did not remove anything. The hatch seal I left was better than the one I found. I checked this later." She was right. I said, "Who are the other 2 people?" She said, "My brother Owen and a woman named Priya Nair, who was my colleague at the Kansas Geological Survey." Kansas Geological Survey. A geologist. A person who read rock and soil and subsurface conditions professionally. I thought about my 32 months of diesel and my 280-foot well, and the water table depth that D. Kessler had been estimating from surface indicators for 3 years. I thought about the fact that I had drilled my well based on a contractor's recommendation and a state survey document from 1987. I said, "What does Ms. Nair know about this site?" Diane Kessler said, "She knows why your well is at risk during a prolonged drought and what to do about it." I pressed the elevator button. Diane Kessler was 47 years old. She had been a structural engineer with a Kansas City firm for 18 years before taking a position with the Kansas Historic Preservation Office, assessing Cold War-era military installations for structural integrity and historical significance. She had assessed 41 Atlas sites. She had written the federal report that established condition standards for decommissioned missile infrastructure across the Central Plains. She had first visited this site in her professional capacity in 2019 and had continued visiting it because, she said in her first hour inside the facility, it was the best preserved Atlas F in the state, and because she had decided in 2020 that if a significant disruption occurred, she wanted to be somewhere with a reinforced concrete structure and a well and a generator, and she had spent 2 years identifying this as the best available option within driving distance of her house in Salina. She had not purchased it because she did not have the capital. She had not broken in any meaningful sense, because an emergency egress that opens with a turn of 2 bolts is not a locked room. She had simply been waiting. I showed her the facility. She did not comment on the furnishings or the console or the cost of any individual component. She commented on the elevator shaft gasket, which she said showed thermal stress consistent with a temperature differential I had not accounted for in the climate design. She commented on the air return positioning on level 2, which she said would create a dead zone in the northeast quadrant of the sleeping area, where CO2 would accumulate at elevated occupancy. She said, "This is a good facility. You built it well. There are 3 things wrong with it that aren't going to matter if you're alone, and 2 of them will matter significantly if you're not." I said, "What's the third?" She said, "The elevator certification. The inspector who signed it in 2021 was not qualified to certify shaft-mounted commercial equipment. His license was for residential hoisted platforms. The safety coefficient he applied is inadequate for the shaft depth. It works, but if the cable tension degrades under sustained temperature cycling, you'll know it when someone is in the cab." I thought about the inspector. I had paid $1,200. I thought about how I had paid him more than his quoted fee, because I wanted him to remember the job favorably. I said, "Can you fix it?" She said, "My brother can. He's a mechanical engineer. That's why I brought him." Owen Kessler was 42. He had been a mechanical systems engineer for a manufacturing company in Lawrence for 15 years before the company consolidated and relocated. He had been doing contract work for the previous 2 years, which meant he had spent 2 years solving problems in facilities he didn't own with tools he didn't always have, which is a different education than the one you get maintaining systems you purchased. He looked at the elevator in the way engineers look at things they are about to take apart, which is with the specific patience of someone who has already built a model in their head and is confirming it against the physical reality. He said, "The tension specification is wrong, not dangerous yet, would have become dangerous in 6 to 8 months of continuous cycling. I need 2 hours and access to the cable housing." I showed him the cable housing. He spent 1 hour and 50 minutes. He did not ask me to help. When he finished, he wrote the correct tension specification on a piece of tape and stuck it to the interior of the housing panel. He said, "Now it's certified." I said, "I paid $1,200 for the certification." He said, "I know. I saw the paperwork in the level 1 cabinet. He charged you for a job he wasn't licensed to do. The cable was never properly tensioned. For the actual work, you owe me a meal." He said it without emphasis. I made him dinner. It was a better dinner than I had made myself on day 1. Not because the ingredients were different. Because I had someone to cook for. Priya Nair was 44 years old. She had been a hydrogeologist with the Kansas Geological Survey for 16 years, specializing in Permian Basin water table analysis and contaminant monitoring in agricultural districts. She knew where the water was and where it was going. She had read the state survey document I had used to select my well depth. She had, in fact, been one of the two authors of the 2019 update to that document. She said, "The 1987 baseline you used is correct for normal precipitation years. In a drought year, which we are currently in and which may extend given the disruption to agricultural water management in the next 12 months, the static water level in this formation drops. Your well is at 280 feet. In a sustained drought scenario, you could be drawing against a declining water table within 8 to 10 months. I said, "What's the solution?" She said, "The solution is to deepen the well or to establish a secondary draw point at a different location. I know where the secondary draw point should be. I identified it when I reviewed Diane's site assessments." She pulled a folded copy of a topographic survey from her jacket. The survey showed my property and the surrounding terrain. She had marked a point 200 meters east of the main shaft, where a buried channel in the Permian Formation created a natural water concentration point. A good well drilled there would not be affected by the drought year drawdown. She said, "We can't drill a well right now, but we can do a percussion test to confirm the location and cache that information for when conditions allow surface work." I said, "How do you do a percussion test without drilling equipment?" She said, "You drive a steel rod 3 feet into the soil at the marked location and measure the acoustic response. I have the rod. I made it from rebar last winter. I've been carrying it in my car for 4 months because I had a feeling I'd need it before long." She had been preparing for this visit for 4 months. With a piece of rebar she made herself. I had spent 2 years and $2 million. We were both here. Day 6. I want to account for day 6 precisely, because it was the day the geometry of the facility changed in a way I had not designed for and could not reverse. At 3:40 p.m., Diane was monitoring the shortwave when a transmission came in on a frequency she had been scanning that I had not known to scan. She had been scanning it because it was a frequency used by the Kansas Division of Emergency Management for internal coordination during the 2019 flood response, and she had kept the frequency in her radio protocol since then. The transmission was from a woman identifying herself as Deputy Administrator Sims, KDEM, broadcasting from a temporary coordination point in Council Grove. She was asking for any hardened facilities in the region to identify themselves and report capacity. Diane looked at me. I said, "Don't respond." She said, "Why?" I said, "Because responding tells them where we are." She said, "They may already know. This site is in the State Infrastructure Survey. I wrote the survey. This site is in it." I had not known the site was in the State Infrastructure Survey. I said, "You put it in the survey." She said, "I was doing my job. It's a historically significant military installation in structurally sound condition with verified utility infrastructure. Of course it's in the survey." The facility I had spent $230,000 making invisible from the county road was documented in a state government database. I sat at my operations console and felt something that I recognized from my freight business. The feeling of discovering that a process you believed was working had a gap in it that had been open the entire time. In freight, the gap cost you a customer or a cargo. Here, the gap was going to cost me something I hadn't priced. I said, "If we respond, what happens?" Diane said, "We become a coordination node for KDEM, which means communication relay, possibly staging, possibly civilian intake, depending on what KDEM's current capacity situation is." I said, "This facility is designed for 6 people." She said, "There are 4 of us here." I said, "My design basis was 6. She said, your design basis was 1 and you've been glad of 4. She paused. What do you want to do, Russell? What I wanted to do was what I had done on the day the outbreak began. Drive to the facility and lock the door behind me. I wanted the elevator to descend, and the concrete to be adequate, and the 32 months of fuel to be 32 months of mine. I said, what's your recommendation? She said, I recommend we respond and accept whatever coordination responsibility KDEM assigns, not because we're obligated to, because the people on that frequency are trying to manage a situation that's bigger than this facility, and our information will help them and their information will help us. Trade, not charity. I said, and if they send civilians here? She said, then we manage the capacity with the information we have. She said it the way she said most things, as a fact that contained the next step. I pressed the transmit button. I am going to describe the people who arrived without cataloging what each person cost my fuel reserve and food supply, because that calculation is how I was thinking at the time, and it was the wrong accounting system. The right accounting system was the one I did not have until later. What each person could do. KDEM sent us a communications technician named Terry, 29, who had been a ham radio operator since he was 14, and who within 4 hours of arrival had extended our shortwave range by 30%, using an antenna he assembled from materials in my level 3 storage that I had purchased for a different purpose and would not have used correctly. He did not ask if he could use the materials. He looked at them, understood what they were for, and used them. The question of whether he should have asked is one I thought about for 3 days and stopped thinking about on the morning Terry's antenna reached a survivor group in Emporia that we were then able to route toward a KDEM collection point. A couple named Bert and Margaret, who had been waiting in their truck at the county road for 2 hours before Diane found them on foot and brought them in. Bert had been a journeyman electrician for 40 years. He looked at my electrical panel on level 2 and said, without being asked, that my grounding configuration would cause harmonic distortion in the generator output under load, and that the distortion would degrade my sensitive electronics over time. He corrected it in 30 minutes. He used a tool from his truck. The tool cost $12 at a hardware store. The distortion it prevented would eventually have required replacement of the communications console. Replacement cost $28,000. The $12 tool math did not require a spreadsheet. Margaret had been a cook for a school district cafeteria for 31 years. She looked at my food inventory and said, "You bought this all wrong." I said, "I built the inventory to a caloric model." She said, "Calories aren't the problem. Nutrition is. You have too much of everything that keeps you alive and not enough of the things that keep you sane." She went through the storage with a list she wrote on her hand. She identified 11 things I was short on that had nothing to do with caloric content and everything to do with the quality of daily experience. Coffee was adequate. Everything else she flagged was a thing I had not thought of because I had built the inventory around survival as a technical requirement, rather than as a human experience. She said, "Do you have any spices?" I said, "I have salt." She looked at me with the patient disappointment of someone who has fed children for 30 years. She reorganized my storage. She created a meal rotation that used my existing inventory to produce food that people wanted to eat rather than food that sustained them. The meals she made with my ingredients tasted like meals. Mine had tasted like systems maintenance. I ate her food for the first time on day 9. I sat at the dining table on level 2 with 7 other people, and I ate food that tasted like food, and I did not know what to do with the feeling. Day 11. I need to tell you about day 11, because It was the day I understood the thing I had been building toward without knowing it. There were 11 people in the facility. My capacity model had said 6. I had exceeded it by 83%. The generator was running 14 hours daily instead of 12, partly because of the expanded population, and partly because Terry's communications work required sustained power. The food supply was being consumed at a rate that revised my original 36-month estimate down to approximately 22 months. The water system was functioning, but Priya had found a concerning reading in the static water level that suggested the drought year drawdown she had warned about was beginning earlier than projected. I had been keeping these numbers in my operational log on level 4. Every morning I went down in the elevator, sat at my desk, updated the log, and recalculated the timelines. Every morning the timelines were shorter. I had built the facility to give myself time. The presence of other people was spending that time. This was not a feeling. This was arithmetic. On the morning of day 11, Diane found me at the operations console before I had gone down to level 4. She said, "You've been doing the inventory math every morning." I said, "Yes." She said, "So have I. My numbers are different from yours." I said, "What numbers are different?" She said, "You're calculating time remaining. I'm calculating capacity change. They're not the same calculation." I said, "Explain the difference." She sat down at the console. She said, "Your calculation assumes a fixed facility and a growing population drawing it down. Mine assumes a facility that is being improved by the population inside it. Terry's antenna has made us a coordination hub. That hub is producing information we would not have had otherwise. That information has value. Bert's electrical work extended the life of your electronics. That life has value. Priya's water analysis prevented a future crisis. That prevention has value. Margaret's food management reduced waste by approximately 12%, which means your inventory actually goes further with 11 people managed by Margaret than it did with one person managed by you." I said, "You're describing intangible value." She said, "I'm describing value you don't know how to put in a notebook." She looked at the operational log in my hand. She said, "How much did you pay for this facility?" I said, $2.1 million all in. She said, "And if I asked you what it cost to build something that worked, what would you say?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "A facility that works isn't a structure. It's a structure plus the people who maintain it. You bought the structure. The people arrived anyway. Now you have both. What you paid is what the structure cost. What it works as is a different number." I thought about the elevator cable. I had paid $1,200 to have certified incorrectly. I thought about Owen's 2 hours and the piece of tape with the correct specification. I said, "What do you think the facility is worth now?" She said, "I think that's the wrong question. I think the question is what the people inside it are worth, and I don't think you know how to answer that yet." She went back to the communications console. I took the elevator down to level 4. I sat in my chair. I opened the operational log. I looked at the numbers I had written. Then I opened to a new page. I wrote, "Things I paid for that aren't working without someone else." The elevator cable. The well, which Priya had identified as at risk. The electrical panel, which Bert had corrected. The food inventory, which Margaret had reorganized. The communication system, which Terry had extended. The air dead zone on level 2, which Diane had identified. I looked at the list. Every item was something I had purchased and could not maintain alone. I had built a facility for one and stocked it with systems that required multiple competencies. Not because I was stupid. Because I had priced everything and understood nothing about the gap between the price and the function. Day 15. I am going to tell you about the argument because accuracy requires it. Diane and I had been operating in a state of functional tension since day 6. Not hostility. Parallel authority. I had the deed and the operational knowledge. She had the structural expertise and the history with the facility. Every decision had been navigated through a process of quiet negotiation that neither of us had named, because naming it would have required one of us to acknowledge that the other one's authority was legitimate. On day 15, the argument was about the West Hatch. 3 people had arrived at the surface in the previous 48 hours. One of them, a woman named Claudia, had come from the direction of the Devereaux property to the east. She had found the facility by noticing the same exhaust signature that Diane had monitored. She had not found the surface entry. She had found the West Hatch. She had sat above it and waited. When Priya found her on a surface check, Claudia had been sitting on the hatch cover for 4 hours with a water bottle and a book, waiting with the specific patience of someone who knew the hatch was there and believed someone would come. She was 61 years old. She had been a science teacher at Salina Central High School for 32 years. She had a hip replacement that limited her mobility on uneven terrain. She had come across the fields from the east because the road was not safe, and the fields were slower but quieter. She had known about the West Hatch because she was Diane's former high school chemistry teacher, and Diane had told her about the Atlas sites while teaching her own daughter, Claudia's current student, about Cold War history. She had come here because she had nowhere else to go, and she trusted Diane. The argument was this. I said, we cannot keep expanding. We are at 11 people and the systems are at their margins. 13 people is not sustainable. Diane said, the margins are manageable. I said, I calculated them. She said, I know what you calculated. I also calculated them. My margins are wider because I'm accounting for the improvements we've made. Your margins are based on the facility as you designed it. It's not the same facility anymore. I said, it is my facility. I designed it and I built it and I paid for it. Diane looked at me. She said, Russell, I understand why you keep saying that. I want to be honest with you about what it sounds like from the other side of this room. I said, say it. She said, it sounds like a man who is more comfortable with a number than with a person. You know exactly what this facility cost. You don't know exactly what it's worth. And every time something valuable happens here that isn't in your accounting system, you reach for the number you do have, because the number is yours and the value isn't. I was in the kitchen doorway. She was at the operations console. Between us, on the dining table, Bert's tool kit was open, and he was replacing a junction box on the level 2 electrical run that had been showing resistance. Behind me in the kitchen, Margaret was prepping dinner. Upstairs, Terry was on the radio. Downstairs, Owen was doing a quarterly check on the elevator tension. I was standing in the middle of a facility I owned, and I was the least busy person in it. I said, you put this site in the State Infrastructure Survey. She said, yes. I said, you accessed it before I purchased it. She said, yes. I said, and you watched it for 2 years and brought 3 people here who I did not invite. She said, yes to all of those things. I said, you knew more about this site than I did before I bought it. She said, in some ways, yes. I said, why didn't you buy it? She was quiet for a moment. She said, because I didn't have $2 million. I said, that's why it's mine. She said, I'm not arguing with you about the deed, Russell. I'm arguing with you about the difference between owning a thing and being responsible for it. Bert set down his tool. He didn't look up. He said, my wife says those are the same thing. Quiet. The generator hummed. I went to level 4. Day 19. I want to tell you about day 19 because it was when the third and final version of this lesson arrived. Priya had been monitoring the water table every 48 hours using a measurement method she had rigged from a length of steel cable, a calibrated weight, and the access port on the well housing. On day 19, she came to level 2 at 6:30 in the morning and found me at the operations console. She said, the static water level dropped 3 feet overnight. I said, what does that mean? She said, it means the drought year scenario is accelerating. The formation is responding to a recharge deficit that's been building since last November. If the rate of decline continues at this rate, we'll be below reliable draw depth in approximately 11 weeks. 11 weeks. 92 days of water at current draw rates. I had 32 months of fuel, and 12 of them were already spent. I said, what are the options? She said, option 1 is reduced draw rate. We can do this by implementing strict rationing and eliminating non-essential water use. That buys us approximately an additional 3 weeks. I said, option 2. She said, option 2 is the percussion test location I identified in April. If we can confirm the secondary draw point, we can install a hand-driven well casing at that location. The technology isn't complicated. It's a driven point well. People use them on the plains before motorized drilling equipment. I said, can we do it from inside? She said, no. We'd need to work at the surface for 2 to 3 days. In the early morning hours before the temperature makes surface exposure inadvisable, approximately 4 hours per day for 3 days. I said, and the driven casing, where does that come from? She said, I need pipe, steel 1.5-inch diameter threaded ends, 12 lengths of 10 feet each. I said, what do I have in storage? She said, nothing suitable, I've already looked. I said, then we need to find it somewhere else. She said, the Devereaux property has a pole barn. Diane knows the Devereaux family. Their son went to school with Owen. The barn may have materials we can use. I'd like to go look. She said, I'm asking you because it's your facility and your decision whether to organize an external materials run. I looked at her. She had been at this facility for 13 days. In those 13 days, she had identified the well risk, established the monitoring protocol, and located both the primary risk and the secondary solution. I had installed the well. I had paid $31,000 for the drilling. And I was sitting at a console learning from her where my water was going. I said, what do you need from me to do the surface work safely? She said, your knowledge of the site's exterior camera coverage and the movement patterns you've observed in the past 2 weeks. I had been watching the exterior cameras every morning. I had the data. I said, I can give you the windows. She said, then let's go over them. We sat at the operations console for 40 minutes. I showed her everything I had observed. Movement patterns, timing, the specific acoustic triggers that seemed to affect directional orientation. She took notes in her own notebook, which she had been maintaining since her arrival. When we finished, she said, this is useful, thank you. I said, you're the one doing the dangerous work. She said, we each have what the other needs. That's not a compliment, it's just what's true. The driven point well took 4 days. Owen and Priya did the surface work. I managed the exterior cameras and communicated via Terry's radio. Diane coordinated movement. Bert fabricated the pipe couplings Owen needed when the Devereaux barn didn't have the right fittings, using equipment from my level 3 storage that I had purchased for a different purpose. Margaret kept everyone fed. The well hit water on the second day at 68 feet. Good water. Better than my primary well in terms of mineral content, Priya said, because the secondary formation was cleaner. She confirmed this with a test she ran in the mechanical room, using equipment she had brought in her field kit. She had been carrying that test equipment in her car for 7 months. She said good water. Owen said good well. Bert said cold water. He was holding a cup. He looked at me. He said, "Russell, you want some?" I said yes. He handed me the cup. It was cold. It tasted like the Permian Basin and patience and 68 feet of driven steel, and 3 people who had spent 2 days working in the early morning on a hillside in Kansas, because the water system they needed was the one I had not built. I said, "This is good water." Bert said, "Most things that keep you alive are." He went back to the kitchen. Day 26. There were 14 people in the facility. I had stopped calculating the timeline from above and started calculating from below. Not how long until we ran out. How long if we continued to improve. The 2 calculations produced different numbers. The first number was a countdown. The second number was a direction. I had spent my adult life in the counting down business. Freight logistics is a countdown business. You have a truck at point A that needs to be at point B by a specific time with a specific load, and every hour of delay is a deviation from the model. The second kind of calculation was one I had not learned to do. Diane had been doing it since day 6. She managed the facility the way a structural engineer manages a building. Not by protecting it from change, by adapting it to load. A building is designed for a specific load. When the load changes, the engineer assesses the structure and makes adjustments. The structure does not resist change. The structure is changed by change. On day 26, I went down to level 4. I sat at my desk. I opened the operational log. I looked at the entry from day 1, facility secure, conditions outside deteriorating, watch and wait. I turned to a new page. I wrote day 26, 14 occupants, well 2 operational, communications range extended, electrical corrected, food inventory optimized, elevator certified. These are the things the facility became that it wasn't when I built it. I wrote I built a structure. The people inside it built a facility. I looked at what I had written. Then I wrote below it, the difference between a structure and a facility is people who know what to do with it. I bought the structure. The facility cost something I couldn't put in the construction account. I closed the notebook. I went upstairs. Terry was at the radio. Diane was at the operations console. Owen was in the mechanical room. Priya was running a water test. Margaret was in the kitchen. Bert was at his tools. The others were doing the specific tasks that had accreted around each person over 3.5 weeks of shared necessity. I said, "What needs doing?" Diane looked at me. She said, "Owen needs a second set of hands on the pressure gauge calibration." I went to the mechanical room. Owen showed me where to hold the gauge. I held it. He calibrated. He said, "Steady." I was steady. That was all. It was not nothing. We received contact from a National Guard logistics unit on day 31. Their radio operator had been working through the KDEM coordination network and had triangulated our transmission signature. They wanted a facility assessment. They sent a vehicle to the surface entry on day 33. 2 soldiers and a logistics captain named Whitfield. Captain Whitfield was thorough. She walked every level. She asked questions. She wrote in a clipboard. She said, "Who's the facility owner?" I said, "I am." She said, "Who manages facility operations?" I looked at Diane. Diane looked at me. I said, "We share it." Captain Whitfield wrote something. She said, "The fuel reserves are above anything we've found in the region. The water situation is better than reported. Communications coverage from this node has been a material factor in 3 civilian routing decisions in the past week. This facility is a regional asset." I said, "It's a private facility." She said, "It is. We're not here to take it. We're here to ask if you're willing to formalize the coordination relationship you're already providing through KDEM." She said, "In exchange, we can offer resupply priority, medical support, and quarterly visits from an equipment maintenance team." She said, "The choice is yours." I looked around the Level 1 Operations Center. Terry's antenna array. Diane's assessment notes on the console. Bert's junction box, correctly grounded. The photograph of the secondary well location that Priya had taped to the wall. The meal schedule in Margaret's handwriting on the pantry door. Owen's elevator specification on the piece of tape inside the cable housing. I had built this room. I had not built what was in it. I said, "What does formalizing the relationship require from us?" Captain Whitfield said, "A monthly reporting protocol and an agreement to receive and route civilian communications through the existing network. No change to your operational authority. No mandatory intake." I said, "What does Diane think?" Diane looked at me. She said, "I think the secondary well location should be in the report, in case something happens to Priya's notes." She meant if something happens to Priya. I said to Captain Whitfield, "We'll formalize it." She nodded. She made a note. She said, "One more thing, for our records. What's the facility's official designation?" I had never named it. I had filed the construction permits under the property's legal description. I had thought of it in terms of the construction account number. I looked at Diane. She looked at me. I said, "Atlas Site K7. Whitfield wrote it down. She said, "That's the historic designation from the Federal Survey." I said, "Yes." She said, "Not a new name." I thought about this. I said, "The new name is whatever the people inside it make it." She looked at me for a moment. Then she wrote something in her clipboard and closed it. She shook my hand. She shook Diane's hand. She left. I still have the construction receipt. $2,147,000 and some change, the final draw on the account, dated 14 months before the first confirmed case. I keep it in the same desk drawer as the laminated copy of the elevator inspection paperwork, signed by the inspector, who was not licensed to sign it. I keep them together because they tell the same story. I paid for things I believed I had. I had structures. What I needed were functions. The structures became functions when 14 people moved into a space designed for one and brought the knowledge that knowledge costs nothing, takes no space on a shelf, requires no invoice, and cannot be purchased from any supplier. Victor Tran in Craig Lefferts's shelter fixed a pump in 4 minutes with a 10mm wrench. Owen Kessler in my facility certified an elevator in 2 hours with a piece of tape. The 4-minute repair and the 2-hour certification were not line items. They were the difference between a facility that worked and a facility that failed. I had bought the facility. They saved it. Not as a gift. Not from charity. Because they needed it too, and because the only currency that mattered in the 3 months after the outbreak was competence, which is the thing you have when you have learned to do something, not when you have learned to price it. At Camp Nelson, Craig Lefferts dug latrines for 9 hours a day. I did not go to Camp Nelson. I stayed at K7. I monitored cameras. I logged movements. I operated the console I had paid $28,000 for. The console worked. I knew how to run it because I had spent 3 years learning to run it. That was not nothing. It was the first honest thing I had contributed to my own facility. The receipt is in the drawer. The laminate is beside it. The water from the secondary well is cold and clean and tastes like something nobody paid for and everyone earned. On day 42, Diane put my notebook on the operations desk. She said, "I've been reading your logs." I said, "Those are operational records." She said, "I know. They're good records. You're consistent and you're accurate and you document things that other people would not think to document." I said, "It's a professional habit." She said, "It's useful. That's all I'm saying." She went back to the console. I sat at the desk for a moment. Then I opened the notebook. I wrote the date, the time, the occupant count, the generator reading, the water table measurement from the morning's check, the exterior camera summary. I wrote all systems functional, facility operating within parameters. I paused. Then I wrote parameters, the people inside it. I closed the notebook. Downstairs, the secondary well pump was running. The sound it made was the sound of water moving through driven steel pipe into a system built by someone who knew what the land was holding and where to find it. It cost 68 feet. It cost 3 days. It cost a piece of rebar that Priya had made herself and carried in her car for 4 months. It was the most valuable thing in the facility. And it was the only thing in it that wasn't mine.